Sometimes life tests the proud not to break them, but to humble them. There was once a man, rich beyond measure, who thought money could buy everything, even respect. And there was a woman, a maid, whose heart danced with dreams too big for the world to understand. One night, their worlds collided. He mocked her dream. He laughed at her hope. But destiny had a dance of its own, because years later, the same man who once humiliated her would stand before her, asking for forgiveness not with words, but with a tango. And when they danced, the world stood still. This isn't just a story about love. It's a story about pride, redemption, and the moment a billionaire realized the greatest wealth isn't found in gold, but in grace. So listen closely, because by the end of the story, you'll understand why one dance silenced everyone who ever doubted the power of forgiveness. Welcome to BrainFuel, where stories ignite your soul. Here, every tale isn't just heard, it's felt. We bring you real emotions, life-changing lessons, and stories that remind you what it truly means to be human. So sit back, open your heart, because at BrainFuel, we don't just tell stories, we fuel your spirit. The grand ballroom glittered under the golden chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of expensive wine and arrogance. Laughter echoed from every corner as men in tailored suits and women in diamond gowns clinked glasses, pretending to enjoy each other's company. It was one of those nights where money spoke louder than manners, a night where the wealthy came to flaunt, not to feel. And in the middle of that shining world stood Alexander Royce, a young millionaire whose name meant power, whose smile masked a heart of pride. He was tall, charming, and dangerously confident, the kind of man who believed the world existed to entertain him. Everything about him screamed luxury. The Italian suit, the gold watch, even the careless way he held his glass of champagne. But Alexander's greatest addiction wasn't wealth. It was dominance. He loved attention. He loved being admired. And more than anything, he loved feeling superior to others, especially those who worked beneath him. As the clock struck 9, the orchestra began playing a lively tango. The music filled the room, the rhythm sharp and passionate. A pair of professional dancers glided across the marble floor, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. The crowd clapped and cheered, fascinated by the elegance of the performance. Alexander smirked and leaned back in his chair, whispering to his friends, "You know, anyone can learn to dance, but not everyone can own the dance. That's what makes us different from people like her." He nodded toward a young woman standing quietly near the buffet table, a maid in a simple black uniform, holding a silver tray. Her name was Elena. She kept her eyes down, focused only on her job. She moved carefully between tables, refilling glasses, collecting empty plates, pretending not to hear the whispers and laughter. Alexander's friend, a heavy-set man with a loud voice, followed his gaze. "You mean the maid? What about her?" Alexander chuckled. "Watch this." He put down his drink, straightened his jacket, and walked toward her. The music played louder as he approached, the eyes of the guests following with curiosity. Elena froze as a shadow fell across her. "Tell me," Alexander said, his tone dripping with amusement. "Do you know what dance this is?" Elena looked up, startled. "It's tango, sir." Her voice was soft, respectful, almost fearful. He smiled coldly. "Ah, so you do know. That's impressive. Tell me, have you ever danced before?" Her eyes flickered nervously. "Only a little, sir. Long ago." "Long ago?" he repeated, smirking. "Well then, maybe you can show us. What do you say, everyone?" The room erupted in laughter and cheers. Some guests clapped. Others leaned forward eagerly, sensing a show. Elena's hands tightened around the tray. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly. "I'm not dressed for her." "Oh, come on." Alexander interrupted, raising his voice. "It's just a bit of fun. Don't tell me you're afraid." Her face flushed with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear. But the crowd's laughter grew louder, circling her like wolves. Someone shouted, "Dance, girl. Let's see if you got the rhythm." Alexander grinned wider, enjoying the scene. He tilted his head mockingly and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "If you dance this tango, I'll marry you." The room exploded in laughter. Glasses clinked, people whispered. To them, it was a joke, a rich man teasing help. But to Elena, those words cut deep. She stared at him, her chest tightening, humiliation burning behind her eyes. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him that once she was a dancer, that she'd trained for years, dreaming of performing on stages across the world. But after her mother's illness, she had to abandon everything, her dance shoes, her dreams, her pride. Now she was just the maid. And this man, this arrogant, wealthy man, was laughing at the very dream that once kept her alive. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity. The room's laughter echoed like thunder. Alexander leaned closer and whispered, "What's wrong? Don't tell me you've forgotten how to move those feet." Something inside her snapped. For years, Elena had endured silence. She had swallowed insults, smiled through pain, and worked tirelessly to feed her sick mother. But tonight, something different stirred within her. Pride, dignity, the memory of who she used to be. She placed the tray carefully on the nearest table and stood tall. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "Play the music," she said. The laughter died instantly. Alexander blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You said," she repeated, meeting his eyes, "if I dance this tango, you'll marry me, then play the music." A murmur rippled through the guests. Some gasped, others smirked, thinking it was another joke. But Alexander saw something in her eyes, something fierce and unbroken. He smirked again, hiding his sudden discomfort. "Very well," he said, snapping his fingers at the band. "Let's see what the maid can do." The violins began softly, the melody slow and haunting. Elena took one deep breath, her heart racing. For a moment, the world around her disappeared. The laughter, the lights, even Alexander's mocking face. All she could hear was the music. Every beat whispered her name, calling out the dancer she once was. She lifted her chin, closed her eyes, and felt the rhythm flow through her body. And though she hadn't danced in years, something magical happened. Her body remembered. Her soul remembered. As the crowd watched in stunned silence, Elena began to move. But that, my friend, is the moment where the story truly begins. Because what followed after that dance would not only silence every person in that room, it would change Alexander Royce's heart forever. The next morning, long after the laughter from that cruel night had faded, the mansion returned to its usual rhythm. Servants moving quietly through the marble halls, silver polished until it gleamed, and the faint scent of roses drifting from the gardens outside. But for Elena, everything felt different. She had cleaned those same chandeliers, wiped those same floors, and served those same guests hundreds of times. Yet now, every corner of the mansion whispered the echo of his words. "If you dance this tango, I'll marry you." They weren't a compliment. They were a wound, one that pulsed every time she passed the ballroom where it happened. Elena was 24, though her eyes often looked older, eyes that had seen too much loss, too much struggle. She had been working in Alexander Royce's mansion for 2 years. Every morning, before the sun touched the white pillars of the house, she'd already be awake, sweeping, scrubbing, arranging flowers, and preparing breakfast for people who didn't even remember her name. "Good morning, Elena," the butler would say kindly. He was one of the few who treated her with respect. "Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves," she'd reply softly, forcing a smile. Most of the other staff pitied her. They'd seen how Alexander mocked her the night before. Some whispered about it while polishing the silverware. Others shook their heads and said she should have just stayed quiet. But Elena wasn't ashamed. Humiliated, yes, but deep down, something inside her had awakened. When she first came to the mansion, she was a quiet, hopeful girl. She had moved from a small coastal town, carrying nothing but a worn-out suitcase, a few old photos, and a pair of faded dance shoes. She'd tucked those shoes at the bottom of her bag. Not because she thought she'd use them again, but because she couldn't bear to throw away her dreams. Before life hardened her, Elena was a dancer. As a child, she'd spin barefoot on her small balcony, pretending the world was her stage. Her mother, Maria, would clap from the doorway, laughing with pride. "My little swan," she'd say, "one day you'll dance for the world." And for a while, That dream seemed possible. Elena trained at a local academy, learning every movement, every rhythm. Her teachers called her gifted, graceful yet powerful. Then came the letter, an invitation to join a prestigious dance school in Madrid. It was her chance to change everything. But life, cruel and unpredictable, had other plans. Her mother fell sick just days before she was to leave. The doctor said the treatment was expensive. Elena sold her costumes, her jewelry, even her ticket to Madrid. She spent sleepless nights at the hospital, holding her mother's frail hand. "Don't cry, my child," her mother whispered. "Dreams can wait. But I need you now." Elena stayed, and when her mother passed away months later, she had nothing left. No home, no money, no dream. Just an aching emptiness and a pair of old dance shoes that mocked her every time she looked at them. So she moved to the city, took any job she could find, washing dishes, cleaning houses, serving drinks. Eventually, she found work at the Royce Mansion. It paid well enough to survive, and she told herself that was enough. But every night, when she passed a grand ballroom on her way to the servants' quarters, she couldn't resist peeking inside. That ballroom was her secret world. When the lights went out and the last guest left, she'd sneak in. The polished floor gleamed under the moonlight. The mirrors stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting her lonely silhouette. She'd stand in the middle of the room, take a deep breath, and whisper just one dance. And then, barefoot and silent, she'd begin to move. The rhythm came from her heart, not from instruments. She'd spin, step, glide, her body remembering every move it once mastered. For those few minutes, she wasn't a maid anymore. She was Elena, the dancer, the girl her mother believed in, the girl who still existed beneath the uniform and exhaustion. Sometimes tears would fall as she danced, but she never stopped, because in those quiet nights, dance was the only thing that made her feel alive. But after what happened that night at the party, even her secret world felt poisoned. She couldn't enter the ballroom without hearing their laughter. She couldn't touch the floor without remembering Alexander's smirk. She asked herself again and again, why did I let him humiliate me like that? Why didn't I speak up? But then she'd remember his eyes, sharp, powerful, the eyes of a man used control. And she'd remember the guests, watching her like she was entertainment, not a person. Still, something in that humiliation sparked a strange kind of defiance. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't want to stay small forever. One evening, while cleaning the shelves in the study, she overheard Alexander and his friends talking again. "She almost believed you, man," one of them laughed. "That maid actually thought you were serious about marrying her." Alexander laughed too, though it sounded hollow. "I just want to see how far she'd go." "She's brave," another friend said mockingly. "Brave and stupid." Elena froze behind the door, her hands shaking. Every word stabbed deeper. But this time, she didn't cry. She just smiled, a small broken smile. "Brave and stupid," she whispered to herself. "Maybe they're right. But at least I tried." That night, she went to ballroom again. She stood in the dark, staring at her reflection in the mirror. "They see a maid," she whispered, "but I see a dancer. I see my mother's daughter." The moonlight touched her face, and she lifted her chin, whispering a promise to herself. "One day, I'll show them who I really am." And as fate would have it, that day was coming sooner than she thought. Because what Alexander didn't know, what none of them knew, was that beneath the quiet, humble surface of the girl they mocked lived a spirit that could not be broken, a spirit that would soon rise again on the same floor where she was once humiliated, not to beg for respect, but to earn it. And when she finally danced again, the world would fall silent. The night of the charity gala arrived, grander and louder than ever before. Chandeliers glittered like stars over a sea of luxury. Men in crisp tuxedos, women in flowing gowns that shimmered with silver and gold. Laughter spilled like wine, and the orchestra's soft music filled the vast ballroom. It was the kind of night the wealthy adored, a night to show off, to gossip, and to feel untouchable. But behind that curtain of glamour moved people like Elena, dressed in plain black and white, quietly keeping everything perfect. She moved gracefully, balancing trays of crystal glasses and plates of hors d'oeuvres as if she were gliding on air. Her face was calm, polite, but inside her heart beat faster with every step she took past Alexander Royce, the man who had mocked her dreams only weeks ago. She had promised herself she'd forget that night, that humiliation, but his laughter still echoed in her mind. Still, she did her work with quiet dignity, pretending not to notice him laughing loudly with his friends, sipping champagne like he owned the world. Alexander was at his most charming tonight, or at least that's what he believed. His guests surrounded him, laughing at his every joke, praising his expensive suit and his latest business triumph. But behind his confident smile was boredom. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, on moments that reminded him he was above everyone else. And then he saw her, Elena, walking by with a tray of drinks, her expression calm and unbothered, like the night he mocked her had never happened. That quiet strength irritated him. How dare she look so composed? As if he didn't matter. His pride couldn't accept that. He nudged his friend beside him. "See that maid?" he whispered with a smirk. "That's the same one I joked about last time. She still works here." His friend chuckled. "The one who almost danced for you? She's brave." "Brave," Alexander said mockingly. "Or maybe just too proud to know her place." The men laughed, clinking glasses. Alexander's eyes followed Elena again as she served a table across the room. For some reason, the more she ignored him, the more he wanted her attention, not out of interest, but out of ego. He stood up abruptly. "Gentlemen, let's have a little fun," he said with a grin that drew everyone's attention. The orchestra began playing a lively tango tune. Couples moved gracefully onto the dance floor, their movements elegant and practiced. The crowd watched in admiration as the dancers spun, dipped, and swayed in rhythm. Alexander clapped his hands dramatically. "A tango!" he announced loudly, his voice echoing through the room. One of the most passionate dances ever created. But I wonder, he turned his gaze toward Elena, who had just entered the room carrying a tray. Does everyone here truly understand the passion behind it? People turned to look at her. The laughter began softly, uncertainly. Elena froze mid-step, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. Alexander walked closer, smiling, not kindly, but like a predator toying with its prey. "You there," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Do you even know how to dance a tango?" Elena's voice was quiet. I used to, sir." "You used to," he repeated, his smirk growing. "Well then, this is your lucky night. Why don't you show us?" Her eyes widened. "Sir, I can't." "Oh, come on," he interrupted, turning toward the guests. "What do you say, everyone? Should we let the maid show us what she's got?" The crowd cheered, their laughter bouncing off the golden walls. Some shouted yes. Others clapped. The band members exchanged uneasy looks, but kept playing. Elena felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her palms were sweaty, her throat dry. Every eye in the room was on her. The same room where she'd been invisible for years. Now, suddenly, she was the center of attention, not because of talent or respect, but because of cruelty. "I'm not dressed for dancing, sir," she said quietly. Alexander leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Oh, don't worry about that. I'm sure no one expects perfection from Maid." A ripple of laughter followed his words. He straightened up and smirked. "In fact, let's make it interesting." He raised his glass high. "If she can dance this tango with passion, with real emotion, I'll marry her." The room erupted in laughter and applause. Some guests nearly choked on their drinks. It was the most absurd thing they'd ever heard. A millionaire marrying a maid? Impossible. Elena's cheeks flushed red. Her eyes burned with shame. She wanted to run, to disappear, but she stood frozen. Alexander looked at her smugly. "What's wrong? Don't tell me you've lost your courage." Her lips trembled. "You think it's funny to humiliate me?" "Humiliate?" He chuckled. No, my dear. I'm offering you an opportunity. Show me something real. Dance like you mean it." The crowd went silent. Even the musicians hesitated, sensing something different in her tone. Something strong, something that made even Alexander shift slightly. "All right, she said finally, her voice steady. Play the music. The room fell into stunned silence. A murmur spread among the guests. Was she serious? Was she really going to do it? Alexander smirked, amused. Very well, he said with mock courtesy. Play. The violin started again, slow, sharp, and haunting. The first notes of Tango filled the air like a heartbeat. Elena placed a tray on the table, wiped her trembling hands on her apron, and stepped forward. The floor beneath her was polished like a mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, not the maid, but the dancer she once was. The one who had been buried under years of exhaustion, grief, and silence. Her eyes lifted to meet Alexander's. For a moment, everything else vanished, the laughter, the music, the lights. It was just him and her. He crossed his arms, still smirking. Let's see what you've got, he said. Elena inhaled slowly, then closed her eyes. And as the music rose, so did something within her, something powerful, something free. In that instant, the girl they mocked was gone. What stood before them was a woman reborn, strong, graceful, and unbroken. And though no one knew it yet, this would be the dance that would turn humiliation into history and silence every mocking voice that ever laughed at her. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The room, once filled with laughter and music, suddenly fell into an almost sacred silence. The only sound that lingered was a faint whisper of the violin's tuning and the distant hum of the city beyond the tall glass windows. Every eye in the grand ballroom was fixed on one person, the maid who had just dared to challenge a millionaire's mockery. Elena stood alone in the center of the marble floor. Her black uniform looked painfully out of place amid the shimmering gowns and suits that surrounded her. The golden chandeliers above reflected in her eyes like stars trembling in water. She could feel the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. Judgment, curiosity, disbelief. Her heart pounded so loudly that she could hear it echoing in her chest. But behind that nervous beat, there was something else, a strange calm, the quiet before a storm. Alexander Royce leaned lazily against the table, swirling his champagne glass with that same arrogant smile. Well, he said, his voice echoing through the room, we're waiting. A few people chuckled softly. Others looked uneasy. No one knew what to expect. The conductor lifted his hand. The band, though hesitant, obeyed. The first notes of the tango drifted into the air, slow, low, and heavy, like a heartbeat awakening from sleep. Elena closed her eyes. She could feel the cool air brushing against her face, the scent of polished floors and roses filling her lungs. And then she took a single step. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was the step that changed everything. She had danced this tango 1,000 times before, not here, not in front of wealthy strangers, but in her dreams, in the quiet of her room, in the moonlit corners of the empty ballroom after everyone was gone. She had danced the same rhythm over and over again. It was her escape, her prayer, her way of remembering who she once was. Now, she was dancing for something else entirely, for her dignity. As the music swelled, her movements began to flow. Her body remembered what her mind had long tried to forget. Her feet traced invisible patterns across the marble floor, each step precise and deliberate. Her back straightened, her chin lifted, her arms extended with elegance that seemed almost royal. The guests who moments earlier had laughed now sat frozen. Their amusement faded into disbelief. Alexander's smirk faltered. This wasn't a joke anymore. Elena moved with the grace of someone who had been born to dance, the kind of natural rhythm that couldn't be bought or taught. Her every motion told a story, of heartbreak, of survival, of a soul that refused to break. She twirled, the hem of her uniform flaring around her like a shadow flame. The violins rose with her, the beat of the drums matching her heartbeat. The ballroom, once filled with arrogance, now seemed to belong entirely to her. For a moment, the world disappeared. The chandeliers, the crowd, even Alexander, they all faded into the background. In her mind, she was no longer in that mansion. She was back in her childhood home, dancing barefoot on the dusty wooden floor while her mother clapped and laughed. She could almost hear her voice. "My little swan, don't stop. The world will see you one day." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she didn't stop. She spun again, faster this time, the rhythm growing wild. Every movement carried the weight of her story. The years of hunger, the nights of loneliness, the humiliation she had swallowed. This wasn't just a dance anymore. It was a rebellion, a cry, a declaration. I am more than what you think I am. The guests could feel it. The laughter that once filled the room had turned into stunned silence. Some leaned forward, eyes wide. Others whispered, "Who is she?" Even the orchestra seemed caught under her spell. The musicians played not for the guests, not for Alexander, but for her, for the woman who dared to stand alone. Alexander didn't move. His hand, once confidently holding the glass, now trembled slightly. Something stirred inside him, something unfamiliar. Respect, shame, maybe even regret. He had meant to make her a spectacle, a source of laughter. Instead, she had turned his mockery into a masterpiece. He watched her every step. The precision, the power, the emotion. It didn't make sense. How could Maid dance like this? How could someone he considered beneath him command a room so completely? The final notes began to rise, sharp and breathtaking. Elena stepped forward, spun one last time, and ended in a slow, powerful pose. Her head bowed slightly, her arms curved gracefully around her. The music stopped. For a heartbeat, no one dared to breathe. The silence that followed was almost holy. Then, slowly, someone clapped. A single pair of hands, followed by another and another, until the entire room erupted into thunderous applause. The sound was deafening. Elena stood still, chest rising and falling, her face glowing with sweat and tears. But her eyes shone with something purer than victory. Freedom. Alexander set his glass down, speechless. For once, he had no clever words, no arrogance left to hide behind. He stepped forward, hesitant, almost humbled. "Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She turned to him, her gaze steady and cold. "Was that enough passion for you, sir?" The words struck him like lightning. There was no anger in her tone, only quiet strength. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Around them, the applause continued, echoing off the walls of his own mansion, a sound he couldn't control, couldn't silence. She gave a small, respectful nod, then turned away. With every step she took toward the exit, Alexander felt the walls closing in around him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one being admired. For the first time, he wasn't the master of the room. That honor belonged to the woman he had mocked. And as Elena disappeared beyond the tall doors, her final words lingered in his mind, not as a reminder of defiance, but as a mirror reflecting everything he had become. "Was that enough passion for you, sir?" In that silence after her dance, the laughter that had once defined him vanished, replaced by a new sound. The quiet awakening of a man who had just witnessed grace defeat arrogance. And though the night continued, nothing in that ballroom or in Alexander's heart would ever be the same again. The night after the ball, Alexander Royce couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his massive bed, the moonlight spilling across the silk sheets, his mind echoing with the image of Elena's final pose. Her eyes, her strength, her dignity. It haunted him. No amount of luxury could drown it out. The sound of applause, the look of admiration on his guests' faces. All for her. For the first time, Alexander realized that money had never made him powerful. Control had. And in those few minutes on the ballroom floor, he had lost that control completely. Morning came, gray and cold. He walked through his mansion, still feeling the ghost of the music in the air. The servants moved quietly, avoiding his gaze, but his eyes searched for only one face, Elena's. She wasn't there. "Where is she?" he asked sharply. The head maid lowered her eyes. "She left, sir, before dawn. Said she wouldn't be needing her wages." Those words hit him harder than he expected. Wouldn't be needing her wages. She had walked away, not just from him, but from everything that had once defined her world. The man who had mocked her was left with silence, while the woman he underestimated had walked out, carrying her pride intact. Alexander sat down at the grand piano in the corner of the ballroom, the same place where she had danced. The floor still held faint marks of her shoes. He ran his hand across the keys, each note a painful reminder. For the first time, he asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before. Who am I when no one is watching? Weeks passed. Rumors spread through the city like wildfire. The maid who danced the tango, people whispered. Some said she was a professional dancer in disguise. Others believed she had been secretly trained by a famous choreographer. But the truth was simpler and far more powerful. She was just a woman who refused to be humiliated. And Alexander couldn't forget her. He began searching for her quietly, away from the gossip of his rich friends. He went to dance studios, small cafes, and even local theaters. No one knew her. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. One evening, as rain poured down the streets of the city, he stopped by a small dance school on the edge of town. The lights inside flickered warmly, and through the window, he saw a group of young girls practicing. Their teacher clapped softly, correcting their steps with patience and kindness. When she turned around, it was her, Elena. Her hair was tied back, her clothes simple, but her eyes glowed with that same quiet fire. Alexander froze. He didn't know whether to enter or walk away. But before he could decide, she saw him. Their eyes met. Two worlds colliding again, but this time there was no ballroom, no audience, no arrogance. Just truth. He stepped inside slowly, removing his hat. "Elena," he said softly. The children stopped dancing and looked at her curiously. She nodded to them with a small smile. "Keep practicing, girls. I'll be right back." When they were gone, she faced him. "Why are you here?" He hesitated. For the first time in his life, Alexander Royce, the man who owned half the city, couldn't find his words. "I came to say, I'm sorry." Her expression didn't change. "Sorry? For mocking me in front of your friends? For treating me like a game?" He lowered his eyes. "For not seeing you. For being blind to what truly matters." There was silence. The sound of rain tapping against the window filled the room. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Royce," she said quietly. "I danced that night to remind myself who I was, not to prove anything to you." He nodded slowly. "I know, but you did prove something. Not to me, but to everyone. You showed us what grace really looks like." Her eyes softened just a little. Grace doesn't come from wealth or applause. It comes from pain, from surviving it. He looked around the small studio, the old mirrors, the worn-out floor, the laughter of children echoing from the next room. "You're teaching now?" She smiled faintly. "Yes. I couldn't afford to dance to the world, so I decided to teach those who still can." There was something in her smile that broke him completely. Not pity, not pride, but peace. The kind he had never known. "May I ask you something?" he said. "What?" "That night when I told you, if you dance this tango, I'll marry you, did you believe I meant it?" She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glistening. "No, but I wanted you to see that some things can't be bought, not respect, not love, not art." Her words hit deeper than any insult ever could. He took a slow breath. "You were right." There was a pause. Then he said quietly, "But I meant what I said, even if I didn't understand it then. I would be honored if you'd let me earn your forgiveness and maybe your love." Elena's gaze softened, but she shook her head. "Alexander, love isn't earned with guilt. It's built with change." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll change." And for once, he meant it. Months passed. People in the city began noticing a difference in Alexander Royce. He sold several of his luxury properties and opened a foundation to fund art and dance programs for underprivileged children. He spent his days visiting schools, sponsoring young dancers, and every time he did, he thought of her. One afternoon, as he stood in that same small studio, watching the children rehearse, Elena appeared beside him. "You kept your word," she said softly. He turned to her with a smile. "I told you I would change." The room fell quiet as the children finished their routine. A soft tango began playing in the background. Elena looked at him and smiled, that same knowing smile that had once silenced the ballroom. "Care to dance?" she asked. He blinked, surprised. "Here? Now?" She nodded. No audience this time. Just us. He took her hand gently. The music swelled, and they began to move, not as master and maid, not as millionaire and worker, but as two souls who had finally learned what true worth meant. It wasn't a grand performance. It was slow, tender, and perfect, but real. And as they danced, the rain outside stopped. The sun broke through clouds, filling the room with golden light. For Alexander, it felt like redemption. For Elena, it felt like peace. When the song ended, they didn't let go immediately. She whispered, "Now that's what passion really means." And he smiled, tears in his eyes. Yes, and it took a maid to teach me that. From that day on, the legend of the tango that changed everything spread far and wide. Not as a story of humiliation, but as one of forgiveness, transformation, and love born from respect. Because sometimes one dance is enough to awaken a soul and silence a lifetime of arrogance. For days after that night, Alexander Royce couldn't escape the echo of what he had witnessed. The mansion that once seemed alive with music, laughter, and luxury now fell hollow. The golden chandeliers looked dimmer, the expensive paintings lifeless. Every corner whispered one truth. He had been wrong. The woman he had mocked, the one he'd seen as invisible, had become the mirror that showed him his own emptiness. He sat in his office, the same room where he had once made million-dollar deals and boasted about his success. Yet none of those victories mattered now. In his mind, he kept replaying that moment, the way Elena's eyes had locked onto his before she began to dance. There was pain there, yes, but also strength and something else he couldn't name. What haunted him most wasn't embarrassment, but the realization that she hadn't danced for him. She had danced for herself, for her dignity, her worth, and her forgotten dreams. The newspapers couldn't stop talking about it. The maid who silenced a millionaire. One headline read. Another said, "A tango that taught a lesson in grace." Everywhere Alexander went, he heard whispers. At business dinners, parties, even at his private club. His friends tried to laugh it off. "Don't worry, Alex. She just got lucky." But deep down, he couldn't laugh anymore. That night had changed something inside him. He spent hours alone in the ballroom, staring at the floor where she had danced. The faint scuff marks from her shoes still remained like ghostly footprints, a reminder that some moments leave marks you can't erase. He could almost hear her voice. "There's a lot you don't know about people like me, sir. You just never care to look." Those words stung more than any insult ever could. For the first time, Alexander began to look. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before, the tired faces of his staff, the way they avoided eye contact, the quiet exhaustion in their movements. He realized how blind his privilege had made him. These people weren't servants. They were humans with stories, families, and dreams. He remembered how Elena used to hum softly while cleaning the hallways, how her eyes lit up whenever she passed the old gramophone in the ballroom. She had always been surrounded by music, yet no one ever listened. Now he couldn't stop hearing it. Days turned into weeks, but Alexander couldn't shake the emptiness inside him. He tried to bury himself in business, meetings, calls, investments, but even success had lost its flavor. Every victory felt hollow, without meaning. One morning, he called his assistant. "Find out everything you could about Elena, her background, where she's from, her family, everything." It took a few days, but the information came back, and it broke him. She had grown up in a poor neighborhood. Her mother, a seamstress, had fallen ill years ago. Elena had given up her scholarship to a prestigious dance academy to care for her. When her mother passed away, she was left with debts and no family to turn to. She worked as a maid to survive, but never once complained. Alexander read every line twice. He couldn't believe the strength she had carried all those years, silently. That night, he walked out of his mansion and went to the neighborhood where she once lived. It was small, crowded, and filled with noise, children laughing, neighbors talking, the smell of food cooking in the streets. It was alive in a way his mansion never was. He realized with a pang that maybe this was where real life existed. Standing under the dim streetlights, he thought about her, the maid who had reminded him of his own humanity. He had always seen himself as powerful, but power without empathy was just emptiness wearing a suit. he whispered to himself. I mocked her for being poor, but she's richer in soul than I'll ever be. It was the first time in his life he admitted that someone else had taught him something, not through money or status, but through heart. A few days later, Alexander did something that shocked everyone around him. He gathered all his mansion staff in the main hall. The cleaners, gardeners, cooks, drivers, people he had barely acknowledged before. They stood nervously, unsure why the master had called them. Alexander took a deep breath. I've been unfair to all of you, he began. I've treated you as if your work was invisible. But it's not. Without you, this house wouldn't even stand. There was silence. No one moved. Then he added, From today, you'll all receive better pay, proper health care, and more respect, the kind you always deserved. The room filled with stunned faces. Some smiled, others wiped tears. For the first time, they saw not the cold, arrogant man they once feared, but someone trying to change. And deep down, Alexander knew this was the beginning of his redemption. That night, he returned to the ballroom once more. The moonlight poured through the tall windows, painting silver streaks on the polished floor. He stood in the center, remembering how Elena had moved, how every step told a story. He wanted to feel that rhythm again, the heartbeat of truth hidden in every movement. So, awkwardly at first, he tried to dance. Alone, he stepped left, then right, stumbling, laughing at himself, feeling foolish but alive. In that empty room, Alexander finally understood something profound. Tango wasn't just a dance. It was a conversation between two souls, between pride and humility, between who you were and who you could become. And in that quiet, he whispered, Thank you, Elena, for teaching me how to feel again. Weeks passed. One morning, a letter arrived, stamped from Madrid. It was from Elena. She wrote, Mr. Royce, I heard about the changes you made for your staff. That means more than any apology could. I'm in Madrid now, studying at the dance academy I once dreamed of. I want to say thank you, not for helping me, but for helping yourself to see the world differently. Keep dancing, even when no one's watching. Alexander smiled as he read those last lines. The woman he had mocked was now inspiring him, even from across the ocean. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a small wooden box labeled Tango. It was his reminder that one act of kindness, one moment of humility, could change an entire life. That night, he looked out the window of his mansion. The stars shone brighter than they had in years. He realized that the richest people weren't those with the most wealth, but those who could look at another person and see their worth. And for the first time, Alexander Royce, the proud, untouchable millionaire, smiled, not because of what he owned, but because of what he had learned. He whispered into the still night, If I could go back, I wouldn't mock her. I'd join her in that dance that changed everything. Days turned into months, and though Alexander Royce returned to his business, fame, and wealth, something inside him had changed forever. He still attended corporate galas and charity events, but he was no longer the man who walked in with pride and arrogance. His laughter wasn't loud anymore. His words weren't sharp. He had become quieter, thoughtful, almost haunted. But the one question that lingered in his mind, day and night, was simple yet painful. Who was Elena before she became my maid? He had learned fragments of her story, about her mother, her sacrifices, her dreams. But deep down, he wanted to understand the whole truth, not out of guilt, but out of respect. So one rainy afternoon, he called the mansion's oldest staff member, Mrs. Hall, the head housekeeper who had been with his family for over 20 years. When she walked into his office, she seemed surprised. You asked to see me, sir? Alexander nodded. Mrs. Hall, I want to know everything you can tell me about Elena. Her brows furrowed slightly. Elena, sir? Yes, he said softly. The maid who danced that night. Mrs. Hall smiled faintly. I thought you might ask someday. She sat down, her old hands folding neatly in her lap, eyes full of quiet wisdom. Elena was no ordinary girl, Mr. Royce. I knew that from the day she first stepped into this house. She began her story slowly, her voice trembling with memory. Elena's mother was one of the best seamstresses in the city. A kind woman, full of warmth and laughter. But when she fell sick, their world started falling apart. Elena was still young then, maybe 16 or 17, but she worked day and night to care for her mother. She was accepted into the National Dance Academy on scholarship. It was her dream come true. She used to tell everyone, "When I dance, I feel like I'm flying." But the same week she got her acceptance letter, her mother's illness worsened. She didn't even think twice. She gave up her dream to stay by her side. Alexander listened silently, his throat tightening. He had never imagined how much pain hid behind her calm smile. Mrs. Hall continued. After her mother passed, she tried to find work anywhere she could. No one would hire a girl with no experience. So she came here. When she first joined, she looked so fragile, like she was carrying the whole world on her shoulders. But every night, after finishing her chores, I would find her in the ballroom, dancing alone under the moonlight. She paused, smiling softly. She said it made her feel close to her mother again. Alexander felt a deep ache in his chest. He could almost see it, that lonely figure in the dark, dancing barefoot, whispering to the ghost of her dreams. He swallowed hard. Why did anyone tell me? Mrs. Hall looked at him gently. Because you never asked, sir. Those words cut deeper than any wound. That night, Alexander walked into ballroom again. The place looked just as it had the night Elena had danced. The soft moonlight poured through the windows, bathing the room in silver. He stood there, imagining her, the way she had moved, her steps echoing softly across the marble floor, her spirit unbroken despite the world's cruelty. He whispered to the empty room, "You lost everything, yet you still danced." For a moment, it felt like he could hear her laughter faintly, not mocking, but kind, forgiving. He closed his eyes and promised silently, "I'll make this right." The next morning, Alexander called his lawyer. "I want to start a scholarship," he said. "A scholarship, sir?" "Yes," Alexander replied. "For underprivileged artists, dancers, painters, musicians. Anyone who dreams but can't afford to chase it. I want it named after someone." "Who, sir?" He smiled faintly. "Elena Grace." The lawyer hesitated. "Is she family?" Alexander looked out the window at the rising sun and whispered, "No, she's something more, a reminder." The Elena Grace Foundation launched quietly, but it soon became the talk of the city. People praised Alexander for his generosity, unaware of the real story behind it. For him, it wasn't charity, it was redemption. Every dancer who received that scholarship was a living apology, a way to honor the woman who had changed him. And deep down, Alexander hoped that somehow, somewhere, Elena would hear about it. One evening, after a charity gala, Alexander was approached by a young woman. She was one of the scholarship recipients, nervous, holding an envelope. "Sir, I just want to say thank you," she said shyly. "Your foundation gave me a chance to join the Madrid Academy." At that moment, something inside him froze. "The Madrid Academy?" he repeated softly. "Yes," she smiled brightly. "I heard there's an incredible instructor there. Her name is Elena Grace." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. "Did you say Elena Grace?" "Yes, sir. Everyone says she's a miracle, a dancer with a heart of gold. She teaches like every student is her own child." He could barely speak. The world around him blurred as he realized the truth. Elena hadn't just rebuilt her dream. She had turned it into a light for others. She didn't run away from her pain. She had transformed it into beauty. That night, Alexander sat in his study, holding a glass of wine, staring at the rain outside. The sound of it reminded him of that night. The music, her steps, her strength. He whispered to himself, "She did it. She really did it." Then, almost instinctively, he opened his drawer and pulled out a letterhead with the foundation seal. He began to write, "Dear Elena, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't even know if you'd want to. But I heard about what you become, an artist, a teacher, an inspiration. You took the pain I gave you and turned it into something beautiful. You changed lives, not through anger, but through grace. That's who you are, and I finally understand what your dance meant that night. It wasn't about revenge. It was about strength, dignity, and freedom. Thank you for showing me what true greatness looks like. Alexander." He folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and sent it to the academy in Madrid. He didn't expect a reply, and that was okay, because for the first time in his life, he felt peace. In the weeks that followed, Alexander visited the Foundation's training centers regularly. He'd sit quietly at the back of dance rehearsals, watching students spin, leap, and stumble with joy. Every now and then, when one of them fell, he'd smile and whisper, "Get up, keep dancing." That's what she would say. And as he watched their determination, he realized something profound. Life itself was a dance. You could trip, fall, and be mocked, but what mattered was that you kept moving. Elena had taught him that without ever meaning to. She didn't just teach him how to respect others. She taught him how to respect himself. By the end of that year, newspapers carried another headline: Millionaire turned philanthropist honors forgotten, Maid with global dance program. And though Alexander smiled when he read it, he whispered quietly to himself, she was never forgotten, not for a single day. Because deep in his soul, she still danced, the same fearless tango that changed his heart forever. A full year passed since Alexander Royce had last heard anything about Elena Grace. Her name had become a quiet whisper in his mind, not one of guilt anymore, but of gratitude. Every morning when he passed by the mirror, he no longer saw the cold businessman who once mocked a maid. He saw a man still learning how to be human again. He had changed his life completely. He sold his private yacht, donated half his art collection, and downsized from his massive mansion to a simpler estate on the outskirts of the city. People called him foolish. "You're wasting your fortune," they said. But Alexander only smiled, because for once, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He had found purpose. The Elena Grace Foundation had grown faster than anyone expected. It wasn't just a scholarship anymore. It had become a movement. Hundreds of children were learning music, painting, and dance for free. Their laughter filled the halls that used to echo with silence. And every time Alexander watched them practice, he saw her not in person, but in spirit. The way they smiled through their struggles, the way they poured emotion into every movement. It was all Elena. Still, one part of him longed for closure. He had written her that letter months ago, but she had never replied. Maybe she never received it. Or maybe she chose not to. Either way, he didn't blame her. After all, he was the man who once turned her dream into humiliation. One morning, as Alexander walked to the Foundation's main hall, his assistant rushed in, breathless. "Sir, we just received a letter from Spain," she said, handing him an envelope. He froze. The seal on it, the elegant gold crest, was from the Madrid National Dance Academy. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a simple, handwritten note. "Mr. Royce, I received your letter. Thank you for the scholarship in my name. You didn't owe me that, but I'm glad you turned your guilt into something meaningful. There's a performance next month here in Madrid. It's my final show before I dedicate my full time to teaching. If you wish to come, there will be a seat reserved for you. Elena Grace." Alexander read the note 3 times before it truly sank in. She wanted him there. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an open door. Over the next few weeks, Alexander couldn't think about anything else. He cleared his schedule, canceled meetings, and quietly prepared for the trip. When his assistant asked, "Sir, should I book a luxury suite for you?" he smiled faintly and said, "No, just a normal hotel near the academy." The flight to Madrid felt different. The city welcomed him with golden sunlight and music echoing from the streets. Everywhere he looked, people danced, not perfectly but passionately. He couldn't help but smile. On the evening of the performance, he arrived at the Grand Theater. It was a beautiful old building with red velvet curtains and chandeliers that shimmered like stars. The air buzzed with anticipation. As he took his seat, he noticed a name on his ticket. Reserved Alexander Royce. He whispered under his breath, "She really did save me." The lights dimmed and the music began. Elena stepped onto the stage, wearing a flowing crimson dress that moved like fire. The audience fell silent. Her presence commanded the room. She looked stronger, more radiant, more alive than ever before. The orchestra played a slow, haunting tango. Alexander felt his heartbeat sync with the rhythm. Every move she made was a story. Her pain, her strength, her freedom. She danced like she was rewriting her own history. Every spin washing away a scar. Every step claiming victory over the past. And though hundreds of eyes were on her, for one fleeting moment, her gaze found his in the crowd. Their eyes met, not in anger, not in shame, but in quiet recognition. A single tear slipped down his cheek. When the final note ended, the audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet. Flowers rained onto the stage. Elena bowed gracefully, but when she looked up, she saw Alexander still standing there, not clapping wildly, not shouting, just watching with the kind of pride that can only come from remorse turned into admiration. After the show, he waited quietly near the exit. He wasn't sure she'd want to see him, but when she finally appeared, dressed simply now, with her hair tied back, she smiled faintly. "You came," she said softly. "I had to," he replied. "You invited me." She laughed gently, the sound like music. "I didn't think you actually would." He hesitated. "You said it was your final performance. Why stop now?" Her eyes softened. "Because dancing for fame doesn't matter anymore. Teaching others does. I found peace here." He nodded slowly. "You deserve that." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, alive with everything that didn't need be said. Finally, Elena broke it. "I heard what you did. The foundation, the schools, the scholarships. That's beautiful, Alexander." He looked down. "It's because of you. I spent my whole life thinking wealth was power. But you showed me that dignity is stronger than gold." Elena smiled softly. "Maybe we both learned something." He met her eyes again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you that night." "I know," she said gently. "But you did, and it changed us both." He took a slow breath. "Then maybe that's how life teaches. Through mistakes." Elena nodded. "Exactly." They stood there for a long moment, the city lights glowing behind them, the music of Madrid filling the air. It felt like a circle had finally closed, not with revenge, not with romance, but with redemption, before parting. Elena handed him a small envelope. "This is for you," she said. He opened it and found a ticket. Tango de Esperanza, her next charity performance for orphan children. "I thought your last show was tonight?" he asked. She smiled. "That one was for the world. This one is for hope. You're welcome to join." He blinked. "Join? As in?" She laughed. "As in dance. Remember what I said once? If you dance this tango, I'll marry you. Let's see if you can handle it this time." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I can't promise perfection." "Neither can I," she said, smiling. "But we can promise heart." That night, as he returned to his hotel, Alexander felt lighter than he had in years. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Maybe forgiveness isn't something we earn. Maybe it's something we grow into." He thought about the next performance. Not as a businessman, not as a millionaire, but as a man who finally understood that true dance, like life, wasn't about control. It was about connection. And deep down, he knew one thing for sure. This time, when he stepped onto that stage beside her, it wouldn't be about proving anything. It would be about celebrating the rhythm of redemption that had brought them back together. The next morning, when the sun rose over Madrid, Alexander smiled. For the first time, he wasn't chasing success. He was chasing peace, and he had finally found it in the heartbeat of a tango. The Grand Theater was alive again. This time, not for fame, not for money, but for something far greater. A large banner hung above the entrance. Tango de Esperanza, Dance of the Orphans. Inside, hundreds of people filled the seats. Dignitaries, dancers, journalists, and children from Elena's foundation. Yet there was no red carpet, no expensive champagne, no flashing lights. The event felt pure. Alexander stood backstage, wearing a crisp black suit and polished shoes that trembled ever so slightly. It had been decades since he last felt nervous. Deals worth millions never made his hands shake, but this was different. He looked at himself in the mirror. Gone was the arrogant tycoon who once mocked a maid for dreaming. In his place stood a man who had fallen, learned, and risen again This time, guided not by pride but by purpose. He adjusted his tie, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Let's not ruin her rhythm." From behind, Elena appeared, radiant in a white tango dress embroidered with golden threads that shimmered like morning light. Her hair was pulled back into a simple bun, a single red rose tucked behind her ear. "You look nervous," she teased softly. Alexander chuckled. "That obvious?" "A little," she smiled. "But don't worry. Just follow my lead." He smirked. "I thought tango was about leading." Elena raised a brow. "Tonight, it's about harmony." Their eyes met, steady calm, full of unspoken forgiveness. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's special performance, a story told not in words, but in rhythm. Tango of Hope, performed by Elena Grace and Alexander Royce." A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. People recognized the name. Alexander Royce? The billionaire philanthropist? Was this a publicity stunt? Or something more? The lights dimmed. A single spotlight illuminated the stage. The first note of the tango sliced through the silence. Deep, slow, and hauntingly beautiful. Alexander stepped forward, his heartbeat syncing with the music. Elena faced him, her expression serene, her posture graceful. For a moment, they simply stood there, eyes locked, body still, like two souls remembering the pain that had once divided them. Then the dance began. At first, his movements were hesitant, cautious, unsure. He was not a dancer. He was a man learning to move again after years of emotional stiffness. Elena guided him subtly, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her touch steadying his rhythm. The audience watched in awe. Each step told a story. Each glance carried a memory. When he spun her, it wasn't to impress, it was to let her shine. When she leaned against him, it wasn't submission, it was trust. And together, they painted a story that no words could capture. The crowd could feel it, the tension of guilt and grace, the storm of regret giving way to calm forgiveness. Their movements weren't perfect, but they were real. Every motion echoed what their hearts had endured. The arrogance that broke her, the dignity that saved her, the remorse that rebuilt him. And now, the unity that healed them both. Halfway through performance, the music softened, fading into a whisper. Elena broke away and danced alone, her steps light and sorrowful, representing the years she spent in pain and perseverance. Alexander watched, his chest tightening with emotion. Then, as the melody shifted into a triumphant rise, he stepped forward, rejoining her. Their hands met midair, a symbol of reunion, forgiveness, and the rebirth of respect. The crowd held its breath. With every movement, their tango transformed from pain to peace, from distance to closeness. At last, as the final crescendo built, Elena leaned forward and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Now dance this tango as if the world isn't watching." He smiled faintly, with pleasure. The final sequence was breathtaking. Alexander lifted her effortlessly, spinning her beneath the golden lights. When she landed, their faces were inches apart, their breaths mingling, their eyes locked. For a second, time stopped. The last chord struck, powerful, echoing through every corner of the hall, and they froze in perfect stillness, foreheads touching, arms entwined. Silence. Then the entire theater erupted. Thunderous applause filled the air. People stood, shouting, clapping, some even crying. Children cheered, waving little flags with Elena's name on them. The audience didn't just see a dance. They witnessed redemption. As the applause thundered on, Alexander and Elena bowed side by side. For him, this wasn't just a performance. It was confession, apology, and healing all in one. When they finally walked off stage, she turned to him and said, "You did it." He exhaled with a laugh. "Barely. My feet are on fire." She smiled warmly. "But your soul is lighter." He looked at her, eyes shimmering. "You have no idea." She paused, glancing toward the cheering crowd. "They'll talk about this night for years." He shook his head gently. "Let them. The truth is, tonight wasn't for them. It was for us, for the part of us that once got lost in pride and pain." Elena nodded, her voice soft. Then maybe we both found peace. Back in the theater hall, reporters were buzzing, snapping photos, asking questions. Mr. Royce, what inspired you to dance? Elena, is this a comeback? Is there a deeper meaning to tonight's performance? Neither answered. They simply smiled, held hands for a brief moment, and walked out into the cool Madrid night. The city lights glimmered like stars reflecting on wet cobblestones. Music drifted from a nearby cafe, a soft, gentle tango tune. They stopped listening. Elena whispered, "Do you hear that?" Alexander nodded. "It's the same rhythm." She smiled. "No, it's a new one." They stood there, side by side, the world around them fading into silence. It wasn't a love story the way people imagined. It was deeper than romance. It was a story of two souls learning how to forgive, how to grow, and how to dance again, not for applause, but for peace. Alexander turned to her and said, "You once told me, if you dance this tango, I'll marry you." She laughed softly. "That was a long time ago." He smiled. "Then maybe one day we'll dance another one, just for ourselves." She met his gaze and said, "Maybe we already have." And with that, they walked away, two once broken hearts, now moving in perfect rhythm with life itself. As the moonlight bathed the streets of Madrid, the world remained unaware that the greatest dance of all had just taken place. Not on the stage, but in the space between forgiveness and grace. The world talked for weeks about the tango of hope. Headlines across newspapers read, "Billionaire dances for forgiveness." From mockery to meaning, the dance that healed two worlds. When a maid taught a millionaire the true meaning of grace. Clips of the performance went viral online. People from all corners of the world shared the story, not because it was glamorous, but because it was real. It reminded them that no matter how far we fall, there's always a way back to goodness, if we're willing to face our mistakes. But what no one knew was what happened after the spotlight faded. A few days later, Alexander visited Elena one last time. She was at the orphanage, teaching a group of children how to dance. The place was simple, white walls, wooden floors, and laughter echoing through the halls. He stood at the doorway, quietly watching as she guided the little girl's feet, saying softly, "Don't fear the step, feel it. Let the music guide you." When she noticed him, she smiled. "You came." "I promised, didn't I?" he said. She handed the child a glass of juice and walked over. "You didn't have to," she said gently. "I wanted to," he replied. "I had to see this place. It's beautiful." Elena looked around with soft eyes. "These children, they remind me of who I was, broken but full of rhythm." He nodded, watching them twirl clumsily. "You gave them what no money could buy, confidence." She turned to him, studying his expression, "And you gave them opportunity. The foundation has done wonders, Alexander." He smiled faintly. "Maybe we both learned that giving back is the only kind of wealth that never fades." They walked outside together, sitting on a wooden bench beneath a tree. The afternoon sun painted everything gold. For a long time, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "Do you ever think about that night? The one when I said those terrible words?" Elena took a deep breath. "Sometimes, but not with anger anymore. Pain turns into strength when you let it teach you." He looked down. "You had every reason to hate me." "I did," she admitted softly. "But hate only chains the soul. Forgiveness, it frees both." He smiled, eyes glistening. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met." She laughed lightly. "No, I just learned how to dance with pain until it lost its rhythm." For a moment, a warm breeze passed through, carrying the distant sound of music from a nearby cafe. They both listened, the faint hum of a tango melody. Elena tilted her head. "You hear that?" He chuckled. "I do. Seems like the world keeps playing our song." She smiled, her eyes shining. "Maybe it's reminding us that life keeps moving, even after the music ends." A few months later, Alexander returned to New York. He resumed his work, but this time he wasn't the same man. He didn't chase deals or status anymore. Instead, he built schools, funded art programs, and visited children who once had no hope. Every wall of his office was now filled with photos, not of business awards, but of smiling faces, kids dancing, learning, living. One picture stood out, a framed photo of Elena and the children at the orphanage, laughing mid-dance. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "True success is not what you earn, but what you inspire." Whenever guests entered, they always paused at that picture. Some would ask, "Who is she?" And Alexander would simply smile and say, "She's a reason I found my rhythm again." Years passed. The world changed. But the story of the millionaire and the maid became a timeless tale told in classrooms, art festivals, and dance studios. Students would ask, "Did they ever get married?" And the teachers would answer, "Not in the way you think," because their union wasn't about vows or rings. It was about respect, transformation, and the kind of love that doesn't demand possession, only peace. Elena continued to teach. Her orphanage grew into a global network of art academies for underprivileged kids. Each campus had a quote written at its entrance: "Dance, not to be seen, but to feel alive." Every year, she hosted one special event, the Tango of Hope. Dancers from around the world came to perform, and each show ended with a moment of silence, dedicated to the man who had once mocked her, then helped her change the world. One evening, long after Alexander had passed away peacefully in his sleep, she stood on the same stage where they had danced together years before. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. She stepped forward and whispered into the microphone, "Years ago, a man mocked me for dreaming, but that mockery became my strength. He taught me, unintentionally, that even cruelty can be turned into compassion if we choose to rise above it. Tonight, this dance isn't for fame. It's for forgiveness. For every heart that was broken but learned to beat again." Then the music began. She danced, alone gracefully, with tears in her eyes and fire in her soul. Every step was a memory, every turn a heartbeat, every glance toward the heavens a thank you. The audience didn't move. They could feel the weight of her story, of his redemption, of how two completely different worlds collided not to destroy, but to rebuild something sacred. When the final note played, she whispered under her breath, "You finally danced." Alexander and the world watched. The crowd rose in thunderous applause, many with tears streaming down their faces. That night, no one left the theater the same. Something in them had shifted, an understanding that even the most broken of stories can end in beauty. Outside the theater, under the silver glow of the moon, Elena looked up and smiled. The stars twinkled faintly, and for a brief moment, she could almost hear him, that familiar calm voice saying, "You were right, Elena. The real dance begins after the music ends." She closed her eyes, placed a hand on her heart, and whispered back, "Then I'll keep dancing, for both of us." And with that, she walked away slowly, her shadow blending into the night, graceful, peaceful, infinite, because some dances never end. They just live on in the souls they touch. Clapperboard moral of the story: never judge someone by their position in life. Kindness costs nothing, but its impact can change everything. A single act of mockery can destroy, but a single act of grace can rebuild a world. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the ultimate form of strength. And sometimes the most powerful love story isn't about falling in love. It's about learning how to rise together,